Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Well, hello and welcome to this edition of the Living Out podcast. If we haven't met before, my name is Ed Shaw and I'm the Ministry Director at Living Out and have the pleasure of hosting this particular episode. And I'm joined by my friends Andy Robinson and Ashley Hull. Great to see you both this sunny April afternoon in Bristol.
It's sunny in Oxford as well.
And also sunny in Leamington Spa.
Brilliant, fantastic. Well, in this series of the Living Out podcast, as our regular listeners will know, we're going through each chapter of my 2015 book, The Plausibility Problem, which is, let's be honest, it's been a slightly weird experience for me going through this book and actually having to read it again. I was rereading this chapter earlier and thinking, I haven't read this for a very long time. Weird experience for me. I hope it's been a helpful experience for those of you listening. And if you haven't yet read the book, here's an encouragement to actually get and read the book, because turns out it's not bad. I was pleasantly surprised. You know, when I used to read my history essays, you know, after reading them, I used to think, oh no, I can't believe I wrote this. But actually, with the Plausibility Problem, I was, hopefully in a godly way, pleased and perhaps a little proud. But probably shouldn't be admitting that. Anyway, today we're tackling Misstep number 7, which is the idea that godliness is heterosexuality. But before we tackle that misstep, I'm just going to ask my friends what their favourite Christian book is, apart from The Plausibility Problem. Andy, what's your favourite Christian book?
Well, I quite like old books, so I want to go way back to the Puritan era. So Thomas Goodwin's book, The Heart of Christ in Heaven for Sinners on Earth, is just a sort of brilliant book to show Jesus' love and grace and compassion. And it sort of speaks into the way in which sometimes we have wrong images of Jesus. I think Dane Altland's book, Gentle and Lowly, recently is basically a sort of modern version of that. So can I point out the Plausibility Problem is only a classic if people are saying it's their favourite book in about 400 years' time.
When we'll be on season, I don't know what. Of this podcast. Ashley, favourite Christian book?
Yeah, this is a cruel and impossible question. I've narrowed it down to 2 books, a couple of books that in recent years I have read multiple times. One is, in fact, Dane Altland's Gentle and Lowly, so there you go, dual recommendation there. And then the other is John Mark Comer's God Has a Name, where he talks about God's name from Exodus 34. And they've both been very influential books for me.
Very interesting. I like that. I love a book recommendation because it immediately means I can be justified in going out and buying these books that I haven't read. What am I going to go for? Yeah, it's a cruel question. I'm probably going to go for today, partly because I want to be competitive with Andy. I'm going to go for an old book, Thomas Brooks' Precious Remedies Against Satan's Devices was a book that sort of slightly saved me as a Christian, actually, at a point when I was reading it, and it really actually helped me with experience of same-sex attraction and a whole host of other ways. So, yeah, Thomas Brooks, Precious Remedies Against Satan's Devices. It's like a sort of Puritan screw tape letters, is how I've often described it. Well worth a read. So, Godliness is heterosexuality, the sort of 7th misstep that I come up with in the Plausibility Problem that I think Christians, churches have often made when it comes to the Christians, the church, and same-sex attraction. This is quite a controversial chapter in the book. There are plenty of controversial chapters in the book. I think this is perhaps especially controversial. So on today's episode, we're going to take things quite slowly as we explore this misstep. Godliness is heterosexuality, and we're going to start by defining terms, and Andy's very helpfully going to define what heterosexuality is for us. We've already been laughing about the irony of a group of people who aren't heterosexual sitting around defining heterosexuality. Andy volunteered very enthusiastically a few moments ago to define heterosexuality for us. What is it, Andy? Tell us about this thing called heterosexuality.
So this is feeling like an old English lesson, but anyway, it's I believe heterosexuality revolves around sexual attraction to people of the opposite sex. Is that what you were looking for, Ed, or something more profound than that?
No, that is roughly what I was looking for, just to make sure that those who aren't familiar with the term are now familiar with
Excellent.
the term. And that's what we're talking about. So the misstep is godliness is heterosexuality. So godliness is being attracted to the opposite sex. That's the misstep we're exploring. But let's perhaps try and define godliness as well, because that is a bit of a Christian jargon word. We perhaps use it a lot in some churches, our churches. But what is godliness? If you're explaining what godliness is to someone, where would you go? How would you do that? Ashley, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I might go to Andy's favourite book in the Bible, 2 Corinthians. Chapter 3, verse 18 says, "We all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." So I might recite that to somebody, had I got it memorised, and say, so godliness is about letting the Spirit transform us so that we image Jesus as he images the Father, or more succinctly, perhaps just being like Jesus.
Being like Jesus. We like that definition. Andy, anything to add?
No, that's right. It's that sense of being like God in as much as we can be. Obviously, there's certain ways we can't be like God, but there are ways the Bible calls us to be as like him as possible, and that seems to be the gist of godliness.
Okay. So the misstep that Christians have often made is basically to say that to be godly, to be like Jesus, you have to be attracted to people of the opposite sex. And let's just sort of think through, because that immediately sort of gets us thinking, actually, what does godliness looks like when it comes to the whole area of sexuality, the whole area of our sexual desires and feelings and sexual activity? What would a godly sexuality actually look like? What does it look like? What does godliness in this area look like, as it were, in the flesh? Andy?
Well, I mean, sexuality is part of God's good plan. So you see it right back in creation, and there is an expression of sexuality as the first man and woman get together. But I can't see anywhere in the Bible where it's commanded that we should feel sexual attraction to people of the opposite sex, or indeed that we should get married. More in a sense that it's more negative in a sense when you get to godliness as it works its way through the New Testament. So that sense of lust, of desiring people to possess them, as it were, simply because of their attraction, because of our sexual desires. So possessing somebody in that sense that we're not entitled to, that isn't godliness. Rather, godliness seems to be to use our sexuality in a way that pleases God.
Anything you do to sort of flesh that out a bit, Ashley?
I might just comment that fundamentally that's the same as godliness in any other area, that we submit ourselves fully to Jesus and we're obeying his commands and those kind of things. So we do that with our sexualities just as we do with anything else in our lives.
Yeah, sort of giving our sexualities to Jesus, seeking to please Jesus in the way that we express ourselves sexually, keeping sex for marriage between a man and woman, because God's word says that's where sexual activity is to be, is the right place for it to be pursued, but not repressing our sexuality and pretending that it's something that can just produce or should just produce shame and embarrassment, because Jesus, as a perfect human being, had a sexuality and seems to have expressed that in good godly ways while never being involved in a sexual relationship, but using it to serve others. And you're probably all tired of me pointing to John chapter 4, which I think is a great example of Jesus using his sexuality, expressing his sexuality in a godly way, not to take advantage of the woman he's speaking to, but to actually serve her and to point her forward to where all her desires, including her sexual desires, will be satisfied. So in some ways, Jesus is the best example, isn't he, that we can point to in human history of what a godly sexuality looks like. Okay, let's have a couple of clarifying questions. We're moving sort of slowly through some quite sort of big stuff. Can you be godly and heterosexual? Is that actually a possibility, bearing in mind the reality that we all know that ever since the fall, ever since original sin, every human instinct, action, desire has been marred by at the fall, Andy?
Well, I think yes and no is the answer to that. So is it possible by the power of the Spirit to use our sexuality in a way that pleases God? Absolutely. So where you have a husband and wife in a sexual relationship seeking to serve one another within that does seem to please the Lord. And actually where somebody is heterosexual and not in a sexual relationship and wanting to preserve sex for marriage, and so not engaging in a sexual relationship at that point, again, that pleases the Lord. Having said that, because we live in a fallen world, all of us will face temptations at even if simply at the level of our thought life. I suspect nobody will claim they have lived for the Lord perfectly in every aspect of their thought life. And so, yes, it's possible to be godly in our use of sexuality, but all of us will fall short, including those whose attractions for people of the opposite sex.
And is it fair to say that even the godly Christian couple who keep sex for their honeymoon, and there will be something about their sexual activity on their honeymoon, even though it's a man and wife and they're having sex within the context of a Christian marriage, they will be behaving in selfish and ungodly, even as they try and be godly. One of the aspects of human sin is that, we all know, don't we, in every area of life, even when we're trying to be as godly as we possibly can, and even when actually a lot of people say, yeah, you're being godly and keeping sex for marriage, there will be something about our desires and actions that will undermine that because of the fall, and we won't be purely and perfectly godly, even as it were when we are sticking to all the rules. Does that make sense?
I mean, is that you pushing towards the ways in which we can make sex an idol? In a sense, it's where we find our supreme pleasure. We can forget to thank God for it as a good gift, or again, we can use sex to satisfy our own desires rather than serving one another, which does seem to be the gist of sex when you get to 1 Corinthians 7 and so on.
Yeah, and let's be honest, as a pastor, I know that it's not just the same-sex attracted members of my congregation that struggle with their godliness in the whole area of sexuality. Heterosexuality doesn't mean that you don't struggle with godliness when it comes to your sexuality. The number of heterosexual people that I've been pastoring over the years that really struggle with porn and lust, and who've, just admitted that they have been selfish in their sexual relationship within marriage, and a whole host of other things, just reminds us that heterosexuality is not a passport to godliness, that all of us struggle with sin and temptation, and struggle to express ourselves in the sort of self-sacrificial, unselfish way that Jesus asked us to express ourselves in every area of our lives, including our sexual lives.
I think that there are, as we've just been talking about, there are ways in which heterosexual sex can be sinful. But I mean, I think the hope for the newly married Christian couple who are now listening to this in despair is that, the Holy Spirit enables us in all of our weakness. And yes, we live in a fallen world, and so everything is tainted by sin, but we also live in a world that Jesus is redeeming and his kingdom is breaking in. And so these areas in which we struggle and in which we fall short, we don't have to just sit in that miserably by ourselves. We've got the Spirit who enables us to use our sexualities for good and in godly ways.
Great. Okay. What about the sort of the other side? Can you be godly and not heterosexual? Can you be godly and same-sex attracted, lesbian, gay, bisexual? Ashley?
Yeah. So in terms of my own attractions, I am, well, if I have to pick a label, I'll go with bisexual. So I'm attracted to both men and women. And I will just say my heterosexual attractions are no purer or more godly than my homosexual ones are. In both cases, I am tempted to lust. In both cases, I need the Spirit's help to respond in a godly way to those attractions and those temptations. It is the same temptation. If I give into it, it is the same sin. And in both cases, godliness looks like leaning on the Spirit and denying my flesh. So I would say, yes, it is definitely possible to be godly and same-sex attracted, gay, bi, whatever label we want to use in there. It is just as with heterosexuality, it is about how we submit to Jesus and how we respond to our desires and our attractions. I'll say as well that my same-sex attraction is one of the things that God has used the most to form godliness in me. So, for example, when I first started really following Jesus, that was around the age of 20. For a year or two, I went through this process of like daily surrender of my whole life, because I had these feelings for somebody and I knew that without God I could not respond to those feelings in the way that he would ask of me. So I had to go to him every day and give it to him every day and ask for his help every day. And just that grounding in my faith has been fundamental to me. Or whenever I think, oh, I'm doing pretty great actually, and I'm basically perfect and there's nothing really left for the Spirit to do in me, which I know we were all thinking, so I might as well say it. It is my same-sex attraction that brings me back down to earth on that and shows me just how far my heart and my desires are from godly perfection. You know, I know that I can't change myself. I can't change any area of my life. I can't make myself more godly because I have seen the futility of my own efforts in trying to be more godly in my sexuality. I know I need the Spirit. I need his power. That's the only way I can live a godly life and become more like Jesus. So yes, there have been other things, other struggles and temptations and all that sort of thing in my life. But for me, at least, my same-sex attraction is one of the things, as I said, that God has used the most in order to make me more godly, more like Jesus.
So I agree with that. If I was just reminded rereading the chapter from the book of how I say that there, and actually just it was really encouraging to think, yeah, actually that is still true. It's still my same-sex attraction, that it actually very similar ways to what you were saying, actually, is the thing that God's used to sort of undermine my self-righteousness, remind me of my need of Jesus, and just, you know, yeah, it's been the big thing that he's used to make me more and more like Jesus. Andy, anything to add?
Well, I mean, simply that there is no biblical command to say be attracted to the opposite sex, and I think that's just quite important, actually. So for me to be more in line with biblical commands will mean resisting temptation at the level of my thought life, but it won't necessarily mean being attracted to people of the opposite sex. That's just what the biblical commands say or don't say.
If you're enjoying this series, you might want to read the book that it's based on. The good news for bargain lovers is that we have a special listener discount on The Plausibility Problem, as well as Ed's other book, Purposeful Sexuality, and Andrew Bunt's book, Finding Your Best Identity. Go to ivpbooks.com and use the code LIVINGOUT20, that's LIVINGOUT20, to get 20% off. I also wanted to let you know that the Living Out team and our friends at True Freedom Trust are hosting the Family of God Conference in London on Saturday the 17th of June. The event's aimed at church leaders and Christians who experience same-sex attraction. There's going to be a mix of talks from Ephesians, worship, story sharing and seminars. It's likely to be really popular, so don't miss out. Find out more and book a place at livingout.org/events.
Okay, so why all that careful thinking in the first half of this podcast? Why is the idea that godliness is heterosexuality a damaging misstep that individual Christians and churches to make? Both Christians who are heterosexual and Christians who are not. Andy?
I suppose I look back to my teenage years, quarter of a century ago, and just remembering the experience of being a 17, 18-year-old, knowing I was attracted to guys, not girls. And I think assuming God didn't want to know about that, or that was an area of life I just needed to keep away from God, and that if God was really at work in my life, that would change. And so for me as a teenager growing up, probably there was a sense that this was an area of life to be ashamed of, rather than an area of life where I could learn to depend on the Lord and look to his Spirit's help and look to the sufficiency of Jesus' work on the cross. So I think for those, particularly perhaps who are growing up and this is their experience, knowing that this is not an indication that somehow they failed the Lord is just really important.
Yeah, I can remember actually, back to being a teenager, and actually for a long time since, just whenever I was asked about godliness, I'd always basically in my own mind interpret it as a question about how I was doing with same-sex attraction. Even when nobody else knew about my same-sex attraction, my answer would always be, how I was doing with temptation, lust around sexual desires for the same sex, and that I think shows the sort of why this is a misstep, because godliness in my mind was just heterosexuality, and I was totally blind to the steps forward I was making in godliness in other areas of my life, and actually some of the steps I was making forwards in this area of my life, because basically a question around godliness was, when was the last time you masturbated over a man? That's what I thought people were asking. That's how I answered the question. Oh, it's not going very well, or it's going, and it was just so tied up in a concept, a definition of godliness being heterosexuality. Ashley, anything to add from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it can mess with people's discipleship if you are heterosexual, say. As we've been talking about, the goal of a godly life is Christ-likeness, but so often in sexuality we make the goal marriage. Heterosexual marriage is not the dream or the pursuit or the purpose of the Christian life. That is Jesus. And so I've seen people just get so messed up by that and kind of get focused on the wrong thing and think that their happiness or their purpose is going to be found in their future spouse, and actually take their eyes off Jesus as a result. And I think that's incredibly damaging. I've also known this misstep to prevent people from sharing the gospel with their gay friends. Maybe they might believe that Christianity can't be for someone who's gay if you think this misstep and you get all messed up in your thinking about that. Or just not know, even if they think, well, it might be for them, but I just don't understand how these things can work together. It can hinder our preaching of the gospel, and I think that is a massive problem if we're finding something is stopping us from telling people about the good news of Jesus.
Thank you. Any other ways in which this could be a misstep for those who are heterosexual?
I mean, it might be that there are some who would see somebody who's same-sex attracted and say, if you're really going to develop into maturity, you need to become opposite sex attracted, or that becomes the main thing we pray for somebody who's same-sex attracted. Or again, I think this is particularly the case for parents, and maybe they've got a Christian son, daughter wanting to live for Jesus, but they're gay, same-sex attracted, and the main thing you're praying for them is that they somehow get past that and become sort of straight or heterosexual, whereas it may well be that the Lord's purpose is to mature them and make them more like Jesus. They have to depend on him in an area of life that's quite difficult for them.
Great, thank you. So, if we've proved that godliness equals heterosexuality is a misstep, godliness isn't heterosexuality, let's actually talk about how godliness has happened in our lives, what godliness has looked in our lives, and how God's brought it about. So sort of, I don't know, slightly top tip for godliness, particularly perhaps in the area of sexuality, from each of us. I don't know who wants to go first. Andy, go for it.
Oh, thank you. I think it's probably fair to say that godliness won't be heterosexuality, but probably godliness will be my attractions to people of the same sex not becoming all-consuming and not becoming the main drive in life, because that can turn into lust that is sinful. Increasingly, I find two main ways to combat that. The first would be friends, actually. Sin grows in the dark, and so where there's opportunity to have friends, where there's a degree of honesty, that's helped me towards godliness. But Colossians 3 is the passage I keep going back to, actually. It's as we set our heart and mind on things above, where Jesus is, as we're thrilled that we're united with him, hidden with Christ in God. As I gaze on him, that's what gives me the power to put to death things like sexual thought life sins that are sinful. And so being thrilled by Jesus is the way in which I become more like him. Actually, it's very similar to 2 Corinthians 3 that Ashley quoted earlier. As we gaze on Jesus, we become like him. And that will mean being less controlled by some of the sexual temptations we face.
Yeah, I'd also say friendship. in fact, I'd probably say everything Andy's just said, but he already said it and far better than I will, so I won't repeat him. But friendship. So I so often when I am struggling more with temptation, I realise that it is due to a lack of intimacy in the rest of my life, and that yes, there's this presenting like sexual temptation, but really what I'm after is to be known and like to have intimacy with somebody else. So having good intimate friendships in my life and spending time with those people, having good conversations, we talk for 3 hours and stare at each other. I love it. So yeah, just building those friendships and enjoying those friendships I find so helpful for me in terms of living that godly life. It kind of it starts further back before you've even got to the point of being tempted. You kind of like in is it Philippians where Paul talks about whatever is kind of pure and lovely. I am going to say exactly what Andy said. Whatever's pure and lovely, think on those things. It's that kind of idea, kind of bringing in these good things into your life, these life-giving things into your life, focusing more on what you have and you get to say yes to, rather than, oh no, I have to say no to this, that and the other in my life.
Brilliant. And just sort of picking up on that, I think is also when, if people are sitting there thinking, but problem is friends aren't around the whole time, which is true. One of the things I found the most helpful thing was I used to get in the evenings about, 10, 10:15 after, as a pastor, a church meeting. And I got into a pattern of bad activity in the sense of it would just be the time when there was a real struggle with my thought life. I wanted to sort of relax. I wanted to rest. And that became the unhealthy pattern. And rather than just saying, just don't go there, I just started to think, actually, what would be a much more healthy, positive activity at that time of night? And actually, it's turned out starting to watch, when I get in, before I go to bed, a whole series of US TV dramas, and I'm on a cycle. And what level this is sad, but it just works. I watch MASH, I watch Frasier, I watch Modern Family, and basically I hang out with a group of people and I relax and have a laugh. And they are on the TV screen. They are, in that sense, imaginary friends. But it just does what I was doing badly with my thought life in a really positive way. It relaxes me, it helps me switch off, it helps me do something that's relatively positive at the end of the day, rather than going down into a negative spiral. And so, yeah, really oddly, I don't think Paul talks about this in either Colossians or Philippians, watching a good US comedy series. But that would be what I think he might have put in one of these letters, had MASH or Modern Family or Frasier been available in his day.
But you're actually saying, let's do something that you can actually thank God for. So where you have well-written drama, comedy, that is something you can thank God for. So you're enjoying a good gift in creation. Sorry, I'm just theologizing MASH here for you. But that's just my role on the Living Out team, is to theologize Ed a little bit.
Somebody needs to try and do it. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to, at the end of this chapter, I pose the question, how can we all make sure that we aren't appearing to be sexually self-righteous, recognizing that is a massive danger that the church has fallen into over the years, and particularly heterosexual people in the church have fallen into over the years. So how can we avoid that? Any ideas?
Just one of my observations from a number of years as a pastor is that most people, I think, do feel areas of guilt in the area of sexuality. So actually, even your married couple, certainly some of the guys I've spoken to, her husbands, are aware they end up attracted to people other than their wife and so on, and often feel that keenly. It's just we don't talk about that very often. So what happens across the church, it seems to me, is that we're all aware we're sexual sinners. It's just often we pretend that we're not. And probably we all just need a greater degree of honesty to say, look, this is an area, this side of a new creation, where we're all going to face temptation. Sadly, we're probably all going to sin at some level in our thought life. And we need the cross, and we need the work of the Spirit, and we're all on a level playing field in that regard. This is an area we all struggle in, and we all need the Lord's help in it.
I think probably one of the things that perhaps has disappointed me a little bit since the plausibility problem coming out is how few other pastors or heterosexual pastors have and church leaders have been honest about sexual sin, sexual temptation in their own life. I think there are a number of pastors I can think of in the UK who have now come out as experiencing same-sex attraction. I know that we're not the only people that struggle with sexual temptation and who are church leaders, pastors, but others haven't. And I know it's difficult to find the appropriate way of doing that, but I think one of the ways in which we could most undermine the sort of sexual self-righteousness that people pick up about evangelical Christians is be more open and honest in the sort of general way that Andy's just been talking about, but also for some people to be brave enough to be a little bit open and honest about some of the specific ways in which they struggle. I think that takes a lot of thought and planning and prayer. And if someone's married, it can't be a decision that you make alone. But I do think it would help everybody if, we just had a little bit more honesty about this area of our lives, both in general terms and for some people in quite specific terms too. Just a thought. Okay, we've talked a lot about this. Wonderfully, there are a number of resources on the Living Out website that will sort of give you, listener, the chance to explore this a little bit more in our company and in the company of others too. And anything you particularly recommend from the Living Out website in this whole area of godliness, heterosexuality, etc.
Anne's written an article recently that's just really helpful, entitled Putting My Armour On, just exploring some of the practicalities of pursuing godliness, working out when temptation might be particularly difficult to face and so on. So that's definitely worth a read.
Ashley, anything particularly helped you or do you want to point people in the direction of from the Living Out website?
Not from the Living Out website, sorry. I know. There is a book. I believe there is a book review on the Living Out website, so it's not too bad. Too much.
You just get in.
Excellent. Jackie Hill Perry's Gay Girl, Good God. It's a really great story, just generally anyway. But she has a whole chapter on this stuff. She calls it the heterosexual gospel, which I find entertaining. But yeah, that's a great read if you want to think a bit more about this.
Great. And if anybody's listening, thinking, how have they done a whole sort of episode on godliness, heterosexuality, without talking about reparative therapy and change and that sort of thing? I can't believe it. Well, the reason is we've done at least one podcast talking about that, and we've also got an article by me on the website that explores the Living Out's position on all of that, as well as, of course, a whole host of other excellent resources which would encourage you to check out straight away. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks particularly to Ashley and Andy for being part of this episode. Do, as ever, be encouraged to subscribe to this podcast, share it, rate it. Why not? If there's somebody you think, actually, I really wish so-and-so had listened to this, why not send it to them on WhatsApp right now? Next time we'll be looking at, surprise, surprise, misstep number 8. Celibacy is bad for you. A lot of people think that. We'll point out, we'll prove why that's not true. Do join us then. Bye for now.